Welcome, everyone, to this special meeting about security in Europe. On behalf of the European Union Studies program at Tel Aviv University within the School of Political Science, Government and International Affairs, and on behalf of the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration, I welcome you all to this highly topical meeting. I want to especially thank the French Embassy to Israel for making this happen, and especially to the ambassador that has honored us in his presence. I want to thank the delegation of the European Union to Israel and the ambassador, the head of the delegation, to the Mitvim think tank for policy, and to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Israel for their support in organizing and supporting this event, and especially to Dr. Maya Sion from the Mitvim Institute and our great teacher from the EU Studies program here in Tel Aviv, and Toby Green from Bar Ilan University for taking upon themselves the massive task of organizing this event. And I wish us all a very fruitful evening. Thank you.
My name is Dr. Toby Green. I'm a lecturer in the Political Studies Department at Bar Ilan University. Just to remind everybody that this event is on the record and it is being recorded. We have participants here in the room. We also have a number of participants joining us on Zoom, and indeed a number of our speakers are joining us also on Zoom. Those of us joining on Zoom, you may wish to use Speaker View to get the best view of all of our speakers, both those here in the room and those joining us virtually. Participants in the Zoom are asked to remain on mute. There will be an opportunity to ask questions via the chat later on. You're all aware of the topic of today's meeting. We're asking what is the future for European security, what is the potential for European strategic sovereignty, and what the EU calls its strategic compass in the light of the Ukraine crisis, and what is its significance for Israel and the Middle East. And the urgency of this topic requires no explanation. This is the week when Finland and Sweden have applied to join NATO, and our aim is firstly to deepen our understanding of this European policy agenda here in Israel, and also to consider what it means for us here in Israel and the Middle East. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite our first keynote speaker, His Excellency, the Ambassador Eric Danon, Ambassador of France to the State of Israel. Ambassador Danon, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadeh, Ambassador Dimitar Sanchev, dear colleagues, especially the ambassadors who are here and on Zoom. Merci à Lisa d'être là aussi. Dear professors, dear students of Tel Aviv University, let me first of all congratulate Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional and Foreign Policies, and the Israel Association for the Study of European Integration for their initiative and their outstanding work to prepare today's conference. Thank in particular Maya Sion and Toby Green that have been key to allow our conversation to happen. And it is a great pleasure for me to address this conference that comes at a crucial moment to reflect on the future of European security as conventional war is back on European soil for the first time since World War II. Neither Ukraine, nor France, nor Europe, nor NATO wanted this war. On the contrary, we did everything we could to avoid it. Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, a sovereign country, has been met with European unity and resolve. And while we address the immediate consequences of the war in the humanitarian, economic, political, and military fields, we cannot forget that not only had this war upset the balance on the European continent and beyond, it has surely signaled the beginning of a new era. I believe it is of the utmost importance in this context to value the Europeans' readiness to take more responsibility for their own security, to measure how it is likely to shape the future of our defense architecture, and to better understand how this effort is perceived by our strategic partners, This is the purpose of our debates today. The first panel that will take place in a few minutes will cover at length the recent steps towards a more ambitious EU in the fields of security and defense from different perspectives. This increased European effort is not out of nowhere. It is a clear response to major geopolitical shifts and to an increasingly degraded security environment. Several waves of jihadi terrorism, the multidimensional effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the power politics of new international competitors, and now the military aggression of Russia against Ukraine. All these historical developments were as many wake-up calls for the Europeans to do more together in the field of security and defense. But this necessity remained until now to be translated into a genuine political willingness shared by all European partners. And this is what we are witnessing right now. Major steps have been taken along the past few years, especially since 2017, with the establishment of the permanent structured cooperation in the area of security and defense policy, and with the adoption of the European Defense Fund, which were major institutional and financial steps forward. Building on these improvements and aware of the challenges ahead, President Macron decided to put the idea of a more strategically sovereign Europe at the core of the agenda of the French presidency of the European Council. The adoption of the strategic compass last March by the head of states and government of the EU comes as a major achievement in this context. The compass is the EU's first white paper on security and defense. It is an unprecedented exercise in the history of the EU that will contribute to the emergence of a common strategic culture and the strengthening of cohesion among Europeans in the field of defense and security. The compass embodies as such the European political willingness to go forward together in those fields. But it is also, very concretely speaking, a strategy which explains the details of how the Europeans can be more capable and efficient to project force. It is a roadmap for the years to come that sets a very high level of ambition for the EU. But the compass is also about partnerships and how a stronger EU can strengthen cooperation with allies to address common threats and challenges. In particular, we will reinforce strategic partnerships with NATO and the UN through more structured political dialogues as well as operational and thematic cooperation. A stronger EU doesn't mean an isolated EU, on the contrary. This is key to understand the ongoing dynamic. This question of partnership brings us to the second issue of this conference: how an increased European strategic sovereignty will affect and benefit our main strategic partners. We'll be hearing, during the second panel, the perceptions of our Israeli colleagues, distinguished diplomats and experts in European and strategic affairs on this new trend. As the French ambassador to Israel, I tend to believe that a more strategically sovereign Europe is a good way for Europe and Israel to get closer. First of all, it is about perceptions. I am convinced that the current events are likely to change perceptions. Too many of our partners, and probably Israel sometimes, see Europe first and foremost as one brilliant example of a normative and soft power, as an integrated economy and a space of shared values, but without willingness and capabilities to defend itself and to project force when necessary. Those who have been studying European defense and security policy in the last decades know, however, that significant steps have been taken in the recent past, from crisis management to defense investment. And then, as always, it is about interests. Europe and Israel share strategic concerns in our joint neighborhood. The strategic compass is very clear in that regard. The unresolved Syria crisis and its regional consequences, the terrorism movement's activities, especially Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The maritime threats and political conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean, all these challenges directly affect both our European and our regional partners' security and will require increased cooperation to be efficiently tackled. It's the same in the wider Middle East and Gulf region, where active conflicts and persistent instability put our security and economic interests at risk. In particular, addressing nuclear non-proliferation challenges in the region remains of capital importance, and Iran continues to be the central issue for regional security in that regard. On all these issues, and considering our shared concerns, a stronger Europe cannot be ignored by Israel when looking at the strategic dynamics on the map. To conclude, I would like to recall that, for sure, despite the recent major steps forward, a lot remains to be done for the EU to enhance its geopolitical posture. We all know indeed the strategic wisdom of President Lincoln. Even with a compass, we still may have to traverse chasms and swamps, les gouffres et les marécages. This is why the coming months and years will be crucial for the future of European security. I hope today's conversation will be a good way to take stock of the latest achievements, to identify the remaining obstacles, and to measure the full potential of the current trend in our relations with our strategic partners, and in particular with Israel. Thank you very much for your participation and attendance, and I now give the floor to Dimitar for his introductory words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadeh, cher Ambassadeur Danon, dear colleagues, ambassadors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, גבירותיי ורבותיי, מכובדיי. It's a great pleasure for me to address this event. It's important for us to have in-depth discussions about timely and complex issues such as the one we are about to engage in. And I would like to thank all those who have contributed and supported this event. We have gathered today here to discuss the future of Europe's security and defense policies. This is an extremely timely topic since Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has shown the urgent need for a strong, coherent, feasible and realistic European defense posture. Before we delve into our quest for strategic autonomy, which has was enshrined in the so-called strategic compass published last month, first, some hard facts about the EU's role in global affairs. The EU and its member states are the world's number one donor of humanitarian aid, granting 2.1 billion euros to provide millions of people with emergency food, shelter, education, and healthcare in nearly 90 countries. The EU and its members are also the world's biggest provider of development assistance. We provided in 2020 nearly 77 billion euros on development aid, more than the rest of the world combined together. Also, the European Union is a serious provider of security with more than 5,000 soldiers, police and special advisors deployed across 3 continents in 18 civilian missions and military operations to prevent conflicts and build peace. EU is also a leading actor in peace talks. It's one of the 4 members of the Middle East Quartet. And although sadly the peace process between Israelis and Palestinians is currently stuck, we continue to engage with both sides to take small steps that change people's daily lives on the ground. Also, the European Union has notably played important roles in Western Balkans since the wars of the 90s. Also in the 2017 peace agreement between government of Colombia and FARC, and of course in the West's nuclear negotiations with Iran. Still, the European Union realized that it had to reshape its security and defense posture long before Russia's assault on the Ukraine. In recent years, Europe continued to be confronted with conflicts and tensions in its own neighborhood, such as in the Sahel and in Libya. A lot is at stake when instability rises in the European neighborhood. So we have all realized that we have an interest and responsibility to engage in crisis and conflict resolution. This required us to close existing capability gaps and to prevent the exclusion of Europe from the settlement of regional conflicts in favor of other parties. EU was aware despite some progress in recent years, it is collectively still under-equipped to counter the whole range of threats and challenges. Indeed, discussions about the need for strategic autonomy date back several years. Since the beginning of his mandate, the High Representative Josep Borrell insisted that Europe must learn to speak the language of power. And now here we come to the strategic compass. This is a document of 64 pages, and I encourage you all to read it to better understand our assessment of Europe's strategic environment and how we envisage to find new ways and means to defend the European security and the security of our 445 million citizens. 80 years after the World War II, the Russian attack on Ukraine has unleashed the horrors of war once more into the heart of Europe. As the High Representative writes in the foreword to the Compass, the war against Ukraine proves that Europe is even more in danger than we thought just a few months ago. History is accelerating once again. This crisis has made it even clear that we live in a world shaped by raw power politics, where everything is weaponized and where we face a fierce battle of narratives. All these trends were already happening before the Ukraine war started. Now they are accelerating. This means that our response must also accelerate, and it has. The EU has taken rapid actions across the spectrum and broken several taboos along the way, including unprecedented sanctions imposed on Russia and massive support provided to Ukraine, including for the first time ever financing the delivery of military equipment to a country under attack. This has been called Europe's geopolitical awakening. We are absolutely determined to defend the European security order. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence within internationally recognized borders should be fully respected. Our unprecedented support to Ukraine is a testament to our ironclad resolve to restore peace in Europe, together with our partners. The assault on Ukraine is undoubtedly the most serious security crisis our continent has witnessed in decades, but threats to European security come from a variety of sources, both within Europe and beyond. Our security interests are at stake also in the Western Balkans, in the Sahel, in the wider Middle East, and in the Indo-Pacific. And now, to quote briefly from the Compass again, the return to power politics leads some countries to act in terms of historical rights in zones of influence rather than adhering to internationally agreed rules and principles. The high seas, air, the outer space, and the cybersphere are increasingly contested domains. Finally, our world is becoming less free, with human rights, human security, and democratic values put under attack. We face a competition of governance systems accompanied by a real battle of narratives. In this highly confrontational system, the European Union and its member states must invest more in their security and defense to be a stronger political and security actor. The more hostile security environment described in this paragraph forces us to increase our capacity and willingness to act, strengthen our resilience, and ensure solidarity and mutual assistance. We are required to increase our presence, effectiveness, and visibility in Europe and on the global stage through joint efforts and investments. Without going into more details, some of the concrete goals laid out in the strategic compass: reinforcing our civilian and military missions and operations, strengthening our command and control structures, particularly in the military planning and conduct capability, boosting our intelligence capacities to enhance our situational awareness and strategic foresight, increasing our preparedness to respond to cyber attacks, strengthening our actions in the maritime, air, and space domains, including by developing an EU space strategy for security and defense, boosting cooperation with like-minded countries such as the United States, Norway, Canada, United Kingdom, Japan, and others. Israel. Of course, Israel is a strategic partner of the European Union and will remain so. Allow me at this point to reiterate our unwavering commitment to Israel's security and our absolute condemnation of the recent terror attacks. The EU remains firmly committed to the prevention and the fight against terrorism. There are also some very positive developments in this region, and I'm referring, of course, to the Abraham Accords, the normalization agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco, which we have warmly welcomed. We did so because we believe that these agreements help establish new formal relations between countries that have decided to put their differences aside and to engage in a peaceful bilateral cooperation. This is a development that we can only encourage. The Abraham Accords could have also a positive effect on other countries to normalize their relations with Israel, which we believe would promote regional stability, something that the European Union has consistently supported. Indeed, the EU delegation in Tel Aviv has actively worked to bring Israel and the Arab world closer together, for instance, by our three-part series of climate diplomacy workshops together with the Paris Center. Active conflicts and persistent instability in the Middle East put also security and economic interests in Europe at risk. We know that for Israel, Iran is the main concern and even considered by some as an existential threat. Indeed, Iran's direct and indirect support to political and military proxies, as well as the ballistic proliferation and transfer of missiles and weapons to state and non-state actors, remains an important source of regional instability. This is not to say, of course, that the EU and Israel agree on everything regarding Iran. It is not a secret that the EU is leading the efforts to revive the JCPOA, and that many in Israel are opposed to this agreement. I think that the arguments over the nuclear deal, bitter as they may sometimes be, are tactical and not strategic, as our ultimate goal remains the same. We want to prevent the Islamic Republic of Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. We understand Israel's fears over the threat of nuclear armed Iran. We share this concern, and that's precisely why we support the efforts to reach an agreement that would make sure Iran doesn't get its hands on a nuclear bomb. We believe that a multilateral agreement that would put strong safeguard mechanism in place is the best way to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Yes, some people are skeptical about the JCPOA, but it's important to note that even a number of Israeli experts feel that an agreement that puts limits on Iran's nuclear program is better than the current situation in which Tehran is not committed to any restrictions in this regard, and it's getting dangerously close to the nuclear threshold. Given our history, we Europeans will always favor dialogue over confrontation, diplomacy over force, multilateralism over unilateralism. At the same time, let me stress, and with this I'll conclude, that we realize that dialogue, diplomacy, and multilateralism can only succeed if you put power behind it. As High Representative Josep Borrell said more than 2 years ago, the European Union needs to learn the language of power, and the strategic compass will help us all get there. Thank you very much.
We're now going to move to our first panel, where our speakers are joining us remotely via Zoom. Participants in the Zoom are invited to post questions in the chat, which is being monitored by our team. We won't be able to allow participants in the Zoom to ask their own questions directly, so please do remain on mute. But we will try to put some of the questions from the chat to our speakers, as well as questions from the room. There will be a break after this panel for about 15 minutes before we resume with the second panel. So I've asked each of our panelists to give an opening remark of about 7 minutes, and we'll hear first in a moment from Dr. Bruno Tertre, who is a Deputy Director of the Foundation for Strategic Research, FRS, in Paris. We will then hear from Tara Varma, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Then from Dr. Marcin Tulikowski, the head of the International Security Program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Then from Stijn Mols, head of the Division of Security and Defence Policy in Brussels at the European External Action Service. And then from Ambassador Michel Duclos, a special advisor to the Montaigne Institute, and a former French ambassador to the Political and Security Committee in Brussels of the European Union, and a former ambassador of France to Syria and to Switzerland. So I hope Dr. Turtre is with us, joining us from Paris. Dr. Turtre, how do you and others in policy-making community in Paris see this agenda for European strategic sovereignty? What does it mean? And what are the capabilities and the limitations of France as a driver of this agenda and of President Macron in advancing this vision? Dr. Turtre, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we hear you. Please do go on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in Israel virtually. It's better than not being in Israel at all, but it's a pleasure to participate in this gathering. Let me say up front that I think the Ukraine events coming on the top of the COVID crisis actually still make the project of strategic autonomy relevant. And it's not only about defense and security, as I will come to in a moment, but shall I say also up front that it should not be regarded as a French project. It's actually, whether you call it strategic autonomy or sovereign or European sovereignty, concepts that are more or less similar, but maybe Tara, who's done more work on that than I have, will get into the nitty-gritties of these differences. So I think that there's a useful way to talk about this issue, which is very simply to say what strategic autonomy is not. And I can develop this quickly in 7 to 8 points. First of all, even though I'm a French person speaking from France, I should emphasize that no, it's not a French fantasy, but it's an agreed EU goal and has been so for several years. Not necessarily on all the details, of course, but certainly on the principle. Second, I would say that it's never been, as far as defense and security is concerned, it has never been about complete independence from the United States. I mean, words matter, and there's a reason why the words autonomy and the word independence are different. It's more about reducing dependencies and about freedom of action, which is something that all sovereign countries, including Israel, should try for, of course. Third, it's never been, even in France, since you asked me to emphasize the French aspect, it's never been a grand plan. It's more guiding principle. As far as I'm aware, there's never been, and there is no grand French plan for European strategic autonomy in 1,000 pages, even in a basement of the Quai d'Orsay or the Élysée. It's more a general principle, and a proof of that actually is that when you look at the evolution of official speeches and documents for the past 15 years, you do see nuances and differences in the way it has been talked about by the French. Fourth point, it's not only about positive actions, it's also about having the ability to assess the world, and it's also about resilience, the resilience of our societies. Fifth, as I already stated up front, it is most certainly not only about security and defense, and it's perhaps increasingly about more than just security and defense, even though the origins of the expression strategic autonomy, as far as I remember them, is actually a French defense and security document of the early 90s. But it's also increasingly about other areas, cyberspace, health, supply chains, norms, data protection, finance, currency. It's about pretty much every strategic instrument of state and community power. Sixth point, it's not only about the United States. It's about decreased reliance and increased freedom of action from any other major power, notably China or Russia for that matter, because obviously energy, I mean, what the EU is doing right now in terms of energy dependence is also about strategic autonomy, or at least reduced dependencies. At least that's the way I like to present it. Seven, it's not only about the European Union. When you look, for instance, going back to defense and security, what some of the initiatives that have been taken by the French actually in the past 5 years, the European Intervention Initiative, or the so-called Takuba force, which is a cooperation between national special forces. These are European initiatives, but they're not EU initiatives. So of course we have to take into account the fact that the UK is no longer an EU member in particular. And finally, on defense and security, that would be my last point. It's never been conceived as a threat to NATO, or rather, as far as defense and security is concerned. I've been sometimes a direct participant in those debates, and I can assure you that since 96, 95, 96, the French have not seen what they do in terms of defense and security for the EU as a threat to NATO or as a possible substitute for NATO. It's rather, as it has always been, a complement to NATO. And despite the fact that we've been repeating that, I believe acting upon that for more than 20 years, I think there's still that lingering suspicion that exists in many areas around the world. There are other aspects that I could debate that, but I think that it's best that I stop here and wait and see what my colleagues say, so that we see if we complement each other or disagree, and then debate.
From across Europe, as a senior research fellow for the European Council, a senior policy fellow for the European Council on Foreign Relations, an organization with bases all over Europe. So I'm wondering, can you give us a perspective across Europe? What are the issues that are being debated in Brussels? What are the fault lines or the issues between member states? What are the gaps, for example, between Paris, Berlin, and other key European capitals on these issues? Thank you, Tara.
Thanks so much for having me. I have to say, maybe as a disclaimer, it's not always easy being a French person talking about European strategic autonomy. So please be kind. I'll try and make 3 points. The first one is about semantic debates, and Bruno and the ambassadors alluded to that too. Are we talking about European strategic autonomy, European sovereignty, European strategic sovereignty? We've been using them interchangeably, I would say, for the past 4 or 5 years now. Originally, the term that's been used by the French, as Bruno said, since the 1990s, but actually by the European Council, was European strategic autonomy. The European Council has been using this phrase since 2013. So, you can't really say it's just a French term. It's been approved and appropriated by all European Union member states. Otherwise, they would not agree to the communiques. But broadly, European strategic autonomy has been defined as the capacity to act independently in an interdependent world. And it covers 3 competencies. The capacity, the autonomy of information, autonomy of action, autonomy of decision. Generally speaking, I would say until the 24th of February and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, my assessment would have been the EU was autonomous in neither of those 3 competencies. Clearly, in terms of information, intelligence gathering remains a national EU member states capacity, and I think it will remain that way, though there are a number of efforts being put in place right now to harmonize this a little bit. Autonomy of decision, we're getting to it little by little. We're seeing it with the sanctions package. I'll get back to that later. Military aid that was provided, there's been an accelerated, let's say, decision-making process. And autonomy of action, we're seeing it little by little as well, but we are not at a stage right now where we can say the EU is fully autonomous. If we look at the European strategic sovereignty definition, and I'll use the one that has been used by the European Union Institute for Security Studies, it says strategic sovereignty appears to apply to questions about managing interdependencies in trade and critical supplies, reframing strategic partnerships, and sustaining a multilateral order that is under significant pressure as a result of a shifting global order. So European strategic sovereignty seems to cover a much wider ranging set of issues. And I think this is what the EU needs right now. And it's probably why this is the expression that's being used a lot more. And I would say it's not just a semantic debate. It is quite important that the EU thinks about how it can act a lot more. It is being perceived as a geopolitical actor by a number of its geopolitical rivals. And there is a sense for it, not only to be able to use the language of power, but actually to be able to act on this power. Of course, with everything that's been happening since February 24th, this is clearly an apt moment to think about how the EU can be more strategically sovereign. And again, this often has been thought as an opposition or a way to cut off from the US. I don't think that's true. I have never been, as of yet, in a discussion where this has been either the secret or the avowed goal. It has never been the case. It's just that, for sure, under the Donald Trump presidency, at a moment where the US themselves were saying, sometimes at least the US president, that he considered that the European Union was a foe as big to the US as China, that he didn't trust the Europeans. There was a sense for the Europeans to think about how they could, in case of need, be able to act on their own. This doesn't mean moving away from NATO. This doesn't mean the EU will duplicate NATO, but we'll get back to that. Clearly, in the wake of the first phase of the COVID pandemic, the strategic compass was the document that started being discussed, particularly under the German EU presidency in the summer of 2020. This document is quite important because it's been quite a long process, an 18-month process, basically, of a power passation between the German EU presidency and the French EU presidency, which is ending next month. But this is only the third security document that the EU has published since 2003. The second being the global strategy in 2016, which was basically obsolete before it was even born, because it was released a week after the UK decision to leave the EU. And it, of course, included at the time the UK as a major security, diplomatic and military actor providing security to the EU. So since 2016 and a number of major shifts to European security, of course, no document had been published. And I think the compass is not the answer to everything, but the very fact that we managed to publish it at the time that we did, that it was revised, of course, since the Russian aggression to Ukraine, and that it included this aggression in the document, I think shows that the EU is little by little trying to act, to think more strategically and to act more strategically. So again, it's not perfect, but we are getting there. And this is not just an EU document. It is a document that's been appropriated by, I would even say maybe culturally appropriated by the 27 EU member states. And I think this is really important because it carries the weight, not just of the institutions, but of the member states themselves. And maybe to end very quickly, what has happened since February 24th? We've seen extreme cooperation between the EU and NATO, and it's not always been easy, I have to say. And what we've seen is basically a division of labor that demonstrates, according to me, the fact that these two institutions are not competing and they cannot compete. The EU, on the one hand, has been putting forward sanctions packages against Russia that have been all approved until now. We have a 6th package of sanctions with the Russian oil embargo that's being discussed. But, I think most decision makers are hopeful that we'll find a way to carry this forward in the next few days. There's been material and financial help provided to Ukraine, humanitarian help, of course. There's been lethal weapons delivered to Ukraine through the European Peace Facility, and Josep Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs of the European Union, has announced this morning 500 additional billion euros to the already 500 million euros to the additional 1.5 billion that have already been put forward by the EU. So this is 2 billion euros in aid. It's quite a lot. And again, the EU is an economic and financial power, and it is putting this economic and financial power to use, I would say. And NATO, on the other hand, is, of course, putting forward a number of communiques explaining how the alliance's actions are defensive and a response to Russian aggression, that NATO is not a threat to Russia, but it is thinking, of course, of reinforcing its positioning to the east. we've been discussing since a few days, but particularly since this weekend, the potential membership, well, very probable membership of Sweden and Finland to the alliance. And there is the NATO strategic concept, so the new concept that will be published next month as well at the Madrid NATO summit, which will show for a new vision of how NATO sees itself in the world and how it sees itself in terms of the guarantor of European security. So we've seen this move forward, and we've seen a level of, I would say, European unity and transatlantic unity that has been very strong. There are differences between member states, and we've seen them, and we can discuss them a bit later as well in the discussion. But I think in terms of how the EU has been able to act geopolitically, I would not have thought it possible for the EU to do everything that it's been doing for the past 2 months and a half. So I think this in itself is quite a success. And I will stop.
East and Central Europe, especially in the light of recent events in Ukraine. Marcin, please.
Yes, thank you, Toby. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to be virtual in Israel and discuss issues of vital importance for security of Europe. Well, if I were to answer very quickly, I would say that the strategic autonomy concept or strategic sovereignty concept is seen universally from Poland with suspicion. Suspicion and kind of concern that if it is implemented wrongly, it may lead to duplications. With NATO, it may lead to undermining the potential of NATO to defend and deter Russia, and defend its easternmost members, NATO's easternmost members from a potential Russian attack. And that it may be also a kind of a factor which would weaken this transatlantic bond, which is, of course, and all the three, strong, effective NATO with the military capabilities which are available for any potential defense operation of the eastern flank, and a strong and viable link between the US and Europe are seen by Poland as a prerequisite of European security, of peace in Europe. Basically, we do see that without US, without military engagement, there would be much less security in Europe. There would be much bigger risk that Russia would decide one day to test the credibility of NATO guarantees. And the current situation does not really, the fact that Russia is suffering heavy losses in Ukraine, it doesn't change the situation. I mean, in the long run, or already in the midterm, Russia may be as much as a threat as we used to think of it. Why? Because, as you can see, it's not that you have a brilliant tactics or state-of-the-art weapons employed by Russia to inflict damage on Ukraine, but basically that Russian doctrine involves indiscriminate targeting of civilian infrastructure. It does involve committing atrocities, war crimes. This is something what we should bear in mind when thinking about the next Russian threat, how it may evolve, how it may look in the future after Ukraine. If this is the case, then European strategic autonomy should be exploited to the possible extent, the concept, to make the European Union work for NATO. So to make the European Union help member states develop their military capabilities with the use of European Union's defense industrial policy, the European Defense Fund, the PESCO, and so that basically the EU is active as a factor which underwrites, so to say, the defense and deterrence potential of NATO by helping member states to beef up the potential. And we see it in the compass, by the way, that member states agreed that there will be more and more investment into capabilities. So European strategic autonomy can be helpful if it is meant to increase the ability of Europe to, so to say, provide a big, significant burden in defending eastern flank against Russia. And this should be the way, at least in the military dimension, in which we should go. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
On the strategic compass and preparing, I believe, for an upcoming special European Council at the end of this month, dealing with defense issues. So how is, in practice, the EU going to move forward? What can we expect to see in the coming weeks, please?
Thank you very much, Toby, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. First time in Israel, and I hope, of course, to be able to visit Israel physically as well in the near future. So a lot has already been said. We meet at interesting times. The 24th of February has really marked a tectonic shift in our views on European security. As you mentioned, we have a special European Council upcoming at the end of the month. We have Finland and Sweden applying for NATO membership. We have Denmark announcing an opt-out referendum on its CSDP opt-out. And then, of course, we have a NATO summit in Madrid towards the end of June. In this context, the compass adopted almost 2 months ago is set to guide our actions in the field of security and defense for the next 5 to 10 years. And it's important to stress, as the French ambassador has also mentioned, that it is part of a continuum, of course. So if you look back, starting in 2016, I would say, with the EU global strategy, we have made significant steps forward in terms of promoting our security and defense cooperation between member states, including through the European Defense Fund, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, or the creation of the MPCC. And of course, the compass is not the end of the discussion either, and we will see as soon as end of this month already new steps being announced in the field of security and defense, I'm sure. It's also important to stress that the compass in itself is, of course, not the EU's reaction to the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine is clearly reflected into the document, but as such, it was almost 2 years in the making, and it is based on a first ever EU-level threat assessment. Just a few words on that, perhaps. So, of course, apart from the major military conflict taking place on our continent, we see a world in which we're faced with many and increasingly interconnected and multifaceted security threats and challenges. Crisis in multilateralism, return to power politics, a large number of conflicts on and around our borders in Syria, Yemen, Libya, the Sahel, amongst many others, but also more and more cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure, complex hybrid campaigns, disinformation, attempts to destabilize our democratic processes, the weaponization of migrants, vaccines, energy, the list goes on and on. Of course, also the rise of EDTs, emerging and disruptive technologies with potentially very important, significant impact on security and defense. And all of this is happening at the moment when the capacity of our multilateral system to govern these challenges is in crisis. So all in all, the strategic compass gives a pretty grim picture of the EU security environment, and this was already the case before the 24th of February. So what to conclude for European security and defense? Well, first and foremost, that the EU is in danger and we need to act if we want to protect ourselves. Secondly, as also pointed out by previous speakers, the threats we currently face are military in nature. Ukraine is a proof of that, but also many other conflicts in the world. But many of the conflicts and threats we face are not military in nature, and so they require a whole of government approach and responses in the field of state aid, innovation, industrial policies, technological dependencies, etc. Second conclusion, the threats we face as an EU are in many cases transnational and too big for even our largest member states to deal with on an individual basis. I would go even further and say that the threats we face in many cases are too large for the EU alone to deal with them. So the compass, all in all, for me, is a very compelling argument for the EU to step up its cooperation in the field of security and defense. It is also a very compelling argument for us to build our partnerships throughout the world. And just as an example, I did a quick search before the start of this conference. The word strategic autonomy figures once in the strategic compass, the term technological sovereignty twice, and the term partners 78 times. So I think this is a clear indication as well as to our priorities and the message that is part of the compass. What to do against these many threats and challenges? We need to strengthen our ability to act. And one of the proposals that in this respect has received most attention is our proposal to develop a rapid deployment capacity, a 5,000 strong modular force, which would allow the EU to swiftly project its force in a range of different crisis scenarios. And up to 2025, we will be working on developing the C2 arrangements for this new force, building life exercises, developing the scenarios, acquiring the strategic enablers, and so on. And I think this force is really one of the key deliverables of the strategic compass. We also aim to improve our decision-making, including on the possible use of Article 44 of our treaty, which would allow a number of member states to move ahead with specific tasks in the field of CSDP and strengthen our command and control structures. Second, and this is also the second part of the compass, secure. We need to secure the EU's access to strategic domains, outer space, cyber, the high seas. These have all become increasingly contested and congested. And it is for this reason that we have proposed to develop a hybrid toolbox, for instance, but also new measures to counter foreign information manipulation and interference, to strengthen our cyber defenses, and to develop an EU space strategy for security and defense, as well as strengthen the EU's role as a maritime security provider. Third, and this is very important, we need to jointly invest more and better in military capabilities and emerging technologies. We need to fill our strategic gaps and reduce our industrial dependencies. And the opportunity that represents itself now with the budgets on defense rising throughout Europe needs to be used in order for us to spend more in a collaborative way, overcoming the many and well-known obstacles of the past. Fragmentation of our defense industry, lack of economies of scale, lack of interoperability. We spent aggregated amongst the EU 27 almost 200 billion on defense, which is comparable to what Russia or even China spend on defense, yet the output is subpar. So we have proposed to develop a number of capacities, including naval unmanned platforms, future combat air systems, space-based observation, main battle tanks, amongst others. And the compass should help the EU remain at the cutting edge of technological innovation and reduce its vulnerabilities and dependencies. PESCO and European Defence Fund will help, the new Defence Innovation Hub in the European Defence Agency as well. But clearly more is needed, and this will be precisely the topic that will be tackled by the Extraordinary European Council towards the end of the month, on the basis, amongst others, of an analysis of the defense investment gaps that have shown itself also in the wake of the Ukraine crisis. And what we expect to be the result of this European Council is for a number of new incentives to be developed for the European defense technological and industrial base to be further developed. Fourth, lastly, the compass also stresses the importance of partnerships, and of course our relation with NATO and the US are key political priorities. With NATO, we aim to embrace also new areas for cooperation, including in the field of resilience, climate change, space, as well as EDTs. But I think, generally speaking, one of the lessons we have learned since the 24th of February, and one of the major changes that has been made to the compass in the wake of Russian invasion of Ukraine, is the need for the EU to help build the resilience of partners, including against cyber threats or hybrid campaigns. Also the need to strengthen our partnership with NATO, and indeed more and more, I think there is daily proof that NATO and the EU are complementary in their actions. The need to strengthen also military mobility on the European continent. Wider, of course, the compass also stresses the need to develop our partnerships further afield, including with Israel, on the basis of tailor-made partnership offers. Of course, implementation of the compass is key, but I do believe it can be a qualitative step forward in EU security and defense, and it will lead to the EU becoming a more reliable security and defense actor and partner worldwide, including for Israel. I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much.
Returning to Paris, you've represented France in Brussels on the Political and Security Committee, but also here in the Middle East as ambassador to Syria. So I'm interested to know what you think the implications of European strategic sovereignty or this agenda might be for the role of the EU and its members in tackling security challenges here in the Middle East, as well as other places. Ambassador Duclos, please.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you today. what I can bring to the discussion is maybe a sense of perspective, because as you said, I was in a way present at the creation at the time of the PSC, when we launched the first basis of European defense and security policy. And what strikes me with that sense of perspective is a number of things. First, we have to remember that basically defense policy remains in the realm of national sovereignty in Europe. That is to say, it's wrong to see NATO or EU as some kind of supranational organizations which would make decisions on behalf or instead of the national states. For the time being, decisions are made in national capitals. And with that, that brings me to my second point. I think that countries tend to see their security organizations more as a toolbox with a sense of using them on a case-by-case basis. That's why I don't see very much the risk of duplication. There has been no duplication for the time being. But what I see is a good habit to adjust to circumstances. With the war in Ukraine, you have seen the EU taking decisions which were simply unimaginable a few years ago, and even a few months ago, such as financing the transfer of weapons to Ukraine. I think this was true at the European level. It was true also at the national level. And the best example of that being Germany, and changing a lot of its policies, especially in terms of military budget. Third, in the environment of all that, there has been something which has always been key, and which is the consensus or not on those issues, and I would say especially on the threat assessment. In 2000, when we started this business in Brussels, we were able to devise a consensus, mainly between countries of the North, which tended to see security in terms of soft power, and more traditional powers like France and UK at that time, which of course thought that defense was mostly about hard power. At that time, we were able to find a consensus, the same for EU versus NATO. There was a consensus on the complementary nature of the two organizations, with the fact that at that time, it was in the wake of the Saint-Malo agreement, that is to say, a strong common approach in London and Paris. It seems to me that over the years, this consensus has eroded, and I would not say became non-existent, but there was a risk of a very great erosion of the consensus. And the main reason for that was a growing divergence on the threat for a lot of countries in Europe, especially what we continue to call the new member states, the main threat was Russia. For other countries, including France, we used to attach more importance to threats coming from the south, terrorism and things like that. And I must say, we were successful, in my view, to bring a lot of partners to deal with matters, challenges in Sahel. To a large extent, the Ukrainian war is closing this issue. That is to say that there is no doubt anymore for anybody that Russia remains a very important threat. And in the same respect, there is no doubt for all countries in Europe that NATO is the main organization to deal with the Russian threat. But at the same time, recent events have shown that EU can become a geopolitical power. I said financing transfers to Ukraine, but there are also a big part to play, in my view, for EU in financing the necessary or helping finance the necessary developments of military budget in all of our countries. And I see that one of the main results of the current war will be a great effort in all our countries to develop their defenses and deterrence capacities. Now, last point, what will be the effect on the EU and the Middle East? I think it's too early to say because there could be two contradictory effects of the current crisis. First, probably the European powers will focus more on security in Europe, and mainly, as I said, the Russian threat, which would mean there would be less energy, appetite to deal with other situations, such as in the Middle East. But there could be also another effects going in the other direction. And I think this is something we will have to see in the next future. And that other effect would be a change of attitude and a sense of new responsibilities, especially if the US continue to shift towards the Indo-Pacific, and if the kind of geopolitical credentials which the EU has acquired in the Ukraine war will continue to develop. And in that case, there should be an additional reason for the Europeans to focus also on the Middle East, is simply the fact that Russia is also in the Middle East. And so the competition with Russia could also apply in other regions than Europe, and especially in the Middle East. I'm afraid I've already spoken too long, and I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Duclos, and to all of our speakers. In fact, you all kept more or less within the time, so I'm very grateful. And so that does leave us a good opportunity now for questions, both questions here in the room and questions via Zoom for those that would like to post them via the chat. I think first of all, we'll go to participants here in the room and open the opportunity for questions from participants in the room. And a colleague of mine is going to take a microphone around to those that have questions. So please do raise your hand if you would like to ask a question from here inside the room.
Mr. Chairman, if there are no questions for the room, I will have something to respond to one of my distinguished colleagues. But of course, questions from the room should take precedence.
Sorry, I missed my opportunity to see if there were hands raised while I was switching on a microphone. So if anybody raised their hand in the room, please raise it again now so I have an opportunity to see it. Okay, so Bruno, do go ahead. Take this opportunity now while our guests here in the room are having a think.
Of course. For the benefits of our Israeli friends who may be less accustomed to us Europeans to intra-European debates on these issues, I think it might be useful to give you a sense of the counter arguments that are offered to those my friend Marcin just mentioned, to their doubts and skepticism and sometimes outright defiance vis-a-vis the concept of strategic autonomy regarding defense. And since I have the dubious privilege, like Michel, of having been involved in those debates for nearly 30 years now, I'm afraid, I think these are arguments that we are most familiar with. So let me take 1 minute, literally, to counter, in the spirit of a lively debate, the argument. The duplication argument, Martin, is one which we don't see generally. Those who favor more efforts in that direction do not see as valid, because it's going to be the same forces. It will always be the same national forces. And if there is duplication, as a famous American expert said, Republican expert said, there is something like useful duplication, which is very small HQs and stuff which may be needed for autonomous EU operation. So that's hardly duplication with a big D. The idea that it can undermine NATO is frankly rather striking, given that there's never been any question for the EU to do anything like collective defense. So these are different missions. How could it undermine NATO? And finally, the well-worn argument according to which it could weaken the US engagement in Europe, it's one that we in France in particular tend to find perplexing, given that Joe Biden himself, he is actually the president of the United States, has given his blessing to an EU approach, which is complementary to NATO. And this is where we can have a debate. But I tend to think that the US has its own interest in continuing to participate in the defense of Europe, whatever we do or say, but that can be debated. No doubt it has also an interest in selling defense equipment to Europe, something which ties itself to the European continent, as Poland, among other countries, know very well. And finally, I think there's also an argument according to which, and that would be a very French argument, which is to say, I think that the way to ensure that Europeans have a bigger role in the defense of their own continent, something that the Americans have been called for since the late 40s, literally. An additional argument for us to do so is to say, hey, but that's also useful nationally and for Europe. It's not only for NATO. So for all these reasons, the duplication, undermining and weakening argument for me are quite debatable. But that's a very long and old debate. I thought it was maybe interesting for our Israeli friends in particular to have a sense of kind of debates we've been having for nearly 30 years.
Now, I'm going to make sure that Marcin gets a chance to respond to that. But before we do that, I do want to give opportunity to questions from our guests in the room and on Zoom. I do see we have a question on Zoom, but does anybody in the room want to ask a question first of all? I see a hand here, please. Yeah, do go ahead. Maybe we'll try to take more than one. Are there any other hands in the room that would like to also? And I see one at the front here as well. So we'll go one and then two. Yeah, the gentleman here in the grey t-shirt. Yeah, perhaps you could pass the microphone along. Thank you.
Okay, so my question concerns the permanent structured cooperation and the European Defence Fund. So I know that in recent years, the European Union has been advancing its defensive mechanism, so specifically the EDF and PESCO, and I wanted to ask if seeing as third countries are also able to participate in various projects in these frameworks, if you see the possibility of Israel, for instance, participating in certain ad hoc projects, for instance.
Thank you so much. And do tell us your name and affiliation, if you don't mind.
Eli, I'm a student here in the European Union Studies program.
Thank you so much. Thank you so. And there was a question also from our colleague Gil from Mitvim. The question, I hope those on Zoom heard it, was about PESCO and whether there might be an Israeli participation in some of those structured networks for European defense.
So, first of all, my name is Gil Mursian. I'm the CEO of Mitvim. Thank you very much for fascinating presentations, really. From the Israeli point of view, one of the interesting concepts to us, we're trying to understand or analyze, is the concept of providing international security as part of the, let's say, the goal or the mindset of the strategic compass and discussion of European sovereignty. And if you can maybe elaborate a little bit about the internal debates inside Europe regarding the scope of that commitment, whether we are referring mostly to an increased European involvement when it comes to the southern neighborhood, to the immediate regions surrounding Europe, or are we talking about a commitment that goes beyond? We heard about the Indo-Pacific, for example, and so on and so forth. As we understand, it's also a topic of internal debate on the level of commitment. So that's basically my question.
Thank you so much. And I see one question in the chat of the Zoom, which I'm going to read on behalf of Eli Saltzman. It's a question to Steen Mols from the European Commission in Brussels. What is the EU's position on the expansion of NATO to include Sweden and Finland that recently announced their wish to join the alliance? So 3 questions there. I think if we continue in the sequence of the order of speakers, and Bruno, you already had a second go, so maybe I'll jump now to Tara, and I hope everybody will have all of our speakers will have more than one chance to speak again. But Tara, perhaps do you have a response to any of the questions that you've heard, or any of your colleagues' comments?
Thanks a lot. I'll be very brief because I see that quite a few of us on the panel and don't have much time. On EDF and PESCO, can there be third country participation in Israel in particular? I think that could be possible. There are certainly scopes for defense industrial projects, for instance. The EU is trying to do a bit more, and there is an opportunity. This was thought of originally as a way for Norway, which isn't in the EU, for the UK, which is not in the EU anymore, and for the US in particular to be priority partners. But since the EU Indo-Pacific strategy, we've been thinking also about a number of countries in the Indo-Pacific region who could be strategic partners participated in EDF and PESCO in particular, third country participation scheme. In the scheme itself, a third country participation, there is no nominal mention of one state or another. As I said, this was originally thought of more for Norway, the UK and the US. But there is certainly scope for participation from other states who would like to participate in making this a larger project. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Perhaps again, following the sequence, Marcin, we could turn to you now and feel free to respond to Bruno's remark and to other questions and comments that you've heard.
Thank you, and I was so focused on meeting the time that I perhaps spoke initially too quickly and did not add the caveats to these arguments, which I will do now, because this is true, and Bruno, you're perfectly right that we have seen a new dynamics as regards the American approach to European defense, to strategic autonomy, and we have seen since the Rome summit between President Macron and President Biden, we have seen it in the formal statements that European defense, closer defense cooperation in Europe is nothing what the US would not like to see. So on a higher levels, I would say, we have indeed checked these issues. So there should be I would be surprised if we came back to the old type of debates on duplication, on single set of forces. However, when I can see the problem, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, is that The compass, we didn't mention compass in detail, maybe that's not of that interest to our Israel friends, but the compass was, in my assessment, was good for the February 23rd. As regards its military dimension, it is introducing the reforms which have been discussed in the EU for long, as were meant to equip the EU with a more, I would say, with a less theoretical capacity to react in crisis management operations, because the EU had the so-called EU battle groups established like 15 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, and never used for a number of financial, operational, and political issues. So we have had this discussion for the last 5 years or more, what to do with the battle groups. Now we can see that EU RGC is, for me, in my assessment, one of the kind of an evolution of one of the ideas what to do with the EU battle groups. So what the compass is doing in the military part, I'm not speaking about a very good, very needed and wanted parts regarding capabilities, resilience to hybrid threats to the information. But in the military dimension, the EU has just declared that we will build a capacity to the crisis management. And when we are doing this, we're doing this at the time when we will need more and more capabilities in the eastern flank, and at the time when the crisis management model, so to say, I would dare to say even that the liberal interventionism as a concept is in crisis. And even we've seen it in frankly speaking, Afghanistan following the American withdrawal, and also in Sahel with the situation in Mali with the Wagner group and the junta. So basically, we are now in the moment when we are finally developing tools which we needed like 8 years ago. We didn't have it at that time. And at the same time, we don't really know, there will be the scenarios work, of course, but which will be absolutely essential to make sure that there will be no this kind of duplication or no tension, I would say. But basically, at a glance, the EU is developing a tool for crisis management, whereas Europe should now embrace for a longer defense and deterrence against Russia, because, as I said, weaker Russia is not less dangerous Russia. Needless to say, we wouldn't like to see Mariupol-like scenes in the eastern flank, and you don't need hypersonics for that. You need just unguided artillery in large quantities, which Russia will remain. So this is the overall issue, which I would say, and the technical problem I can see, and I'll be very quick here, is that when you have smaller nations approached by EU institutions and by capitals to donate, to contribute forces to the EU rapid deployment capacity, they will have to make a decisions whether they send a deployable unit, which we have still on shortage in Europe, to a crisis to NATO initiative, or to the NRF, for instance, or to rotate to the eastern flank, to the battle groups, or to the EU RGC. So smaller nations may have a problem with, squaring the circle, and there, on a very technical level, there may be kind of duplications, which may result, and that would be a pity for the EU, with simply a large group of member states not interested to contribute to the pool of forces, which will be then established by those who are interested, and which be yet another argument to make a two-speed Europe, which we already seen suggested also again by President Macron. So this is the kind of an issue with undermining security in Europe, with undermining cadre, which I can see as a, for now, theoretical. Don't get me wrong, but I would say a looming behind the corner, so to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So turning now back to Brussels and Stein, perhaps you'd like to take the floor again now, and I just remind you about the question about Sweden and Finland, but also a question about Israeli participation in EU frameworks.
Yes, thank you very much. On EDF and PESCO, nothing much to add to what Tara already mentioned. I think it's important to understand that these frameworks have been developed first and foremost to stimulate cooperation between EU member states. So the design of the instruments per se is not meant to develop partnerships outside of Europe. However, both in EDF and in PESCO, there is a number of conditions and possibilities built in to increase cooperation with third countries, and this is actually borne out in practice, because in the project that have been accepted in the European Defense Fund, for instance, several international non-EU companies have been part of the tendering, and in PESCO, military mobility, for instance, the US, Norway and Canada have joined the project late last year. So could Israel join? Yes, provided it has added value to the project at hand, and of course, provided it respects a number of conditions that have been set by the Council. There's quite a long list of them, but the very fact that the US, Canada, and Norway have managed to join, I think, is proof that the list is certainly not unattainable for strategic partners to the EU. On Finland and Sweden, of course, it's not really up to the EU to comment, or up to me to comment. It's first and foremost up to the Finnish and Swedish governments. And then for NATO, what I would say from an EU perspective is of course that we know that both Finland and Sweden have highly capable and well-equipped, well-trained forces that in practice are already very interoperable with NATO. So I can only imagine, without knowing, that NATO would be more than happy to have these two countries join the club. And from our perspective, of course, that will bring the list of countries that are a member of both organizations to 23. Which I think is from our side also very positive in terms of driving our agenda forward. There was also a question on geographical priorities, so to speak. I slightly disagree with Marcin in the sense that I think the compass was substantially modified after the 24th of February, and that although it is by no means perfect or the final chapter in this discussion, I think it does get the challenges quite right. However, I don't think we have the luxury of saying that we can only deal with Ukraine and its aftermath right now. We have 18 missions engaged worldwide, civilian missions as well, military missions. Unfortunately, as much as we would like it, other crises will continue to require our attention. New crises will erupt, and I think there is no risk there of duplication or doubling work with NATO. I think if the EU doesn't step up to the plate in many of these cases, for instance in the Sahel, for instance in Mozambique, where I think an important case can be made for also EU interests being at stake there indirectly, then I think nobody else is likely to do it. And quite frankly, in Europe, we have the numbers to do it. If you look at our combined defense spending, if you look at the total number of military personnel, we should have the capacity in order to deal with several crises at the same time. So that would be my initial reply to that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And turning now back to you, Michel, do you have anything you'd like to add in response to the questions that we've heard?
No, it seems to me that we have to see what is going to happen at the next European Summit on May 30 and 31. On the issue of Sweden and Finland, I will not be surprised that there could be some positive statement, even though it's not up to the EU to comment, but probably European leaders individually will make a positive noise, it seems to me. This meeting will be also important for other issues as a follow-up to the last Versailles summit. And in my mind, the main issue to follow is this question of how do you fund new efforts of defense, which once again will be mainly national efforts, but with an important part to play by Brussels to help member states to fulfill their new tasks and obligations.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to have a final question from my colleague Maya Sion. She's going to ask a question, and that will give an opportunity also for one final brief response and remark from our panelists, and then we'll conclude here for a break before resuming. So Maya, please.
So thank you for all the speakers for their wonderful presentations. I would love to hear more, Stein, Milo, about the partnerships part that you were mentioning, that is mentioned for 78 times, I think you said, in the strategic compass, and about tailor-made partnerships. And I would like to use that question to connect us to the second panel, the following panel, which will address the Israeli question, maybe Middle Eastern questions, and to see what is the vision in the strategic compass, if you can elaborate on that, you and the rest of the speakers in general, and if you can relate to Israel, if you have anything to relate to Israel or to the Middle East, then that would be a lovely continuation to the second panel.
Thank you, Maya. So, Bruno, if we can come back to you for a response and a final comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually don't have any response to the answer to the question. However, I would like to make it clear that I think that from the EU standpoint, the accession of Finland and Sweden to the Washington Treaty is actually very good news, because it means that there's more convergence between the two institutions. And frankly, I would be very surprised if most, if not all, EU countries were actually quite happy with that membership. It will make EU-NATO cooperation easier.
Thank you very much. Tara?
Just to add to what Bruno has just said, I think there is also an opportunity with the upcoming publication of the NATO strategic concept to make the EU-NATO strategic partnership a bit different and a bit more unique to all the other strategic partnerships that NATO has. And I think this is also what the war, what the war in Ukraine has proved, is that these two institutions need one another because they are complementary and they're going to remain so. But they have a special link that needs to be underlined now.
And thank you so much. Marcin?
Yeah, I will quick. I think that we only started, so to say, despite the fact that European defense is almost 20 years old as an area of EU external activities, and the strategic compass is just the beginning. What I mean by that, in parallel to the adoption to discussion of the strategic compass, which has been updated in the threat perceptions part to reflect on the situation, on the Russian aggression on Ukraine, the Russian invasion on Ukraine, many important things happened outside the compass. You mentioned the use of the European Peace Facility to actually fund the provisions of weapons to Ukraine. This is, I would say, a breakthrough. This is something what was not, Tara mentioned, that was not imaginable already 3 or 4 months ago, and prior to the Russian invasion on Ukraine. And this shows that we may have, with the next reiteration of Compass and the work on the threat perception and the analysis of the security environment will start later this year already. So we will start the process of updating this document. So the next iteration of the Compass may push the envelope of what the EU is doing for defense and deterrence. And if this is the case, then we will have a clear, I would dare to say, kind of division of labor, and I will be never any longer talk about duplications and threats to NATO or challenges to NATO and strategic bond between US and Europe. It's just in the hands of our policy masters. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And returning to Stein, back, please.
Yes, thank you. Very shortly, I think the strategic compass repeatedly stresses the importance of partnerships a lot more as it does the focus on strategic autonomy, as I said. But I think in general terms, what it means is that the EU recognizes that it needs to construct its partnerships based on its own interest, but also based on that of its partners, and that we are perhaps more than in the past ready to discuss with partners to make sure that the partnerships we develop are tailor-made, that we go away from big conferences where basically all partners of the same region are offered the same menu of cooperation with the EU. So this could be done through well, specific dialogues or topics of shared interest, developing projects. Now, this, of course, will need to take shape in the next few months and years. And it would be a bit too soon for me to comment specifically as to what it could entail in relation to Israel, because as for now, a lot of our focus has been on strategic partnership with NATO and with the UN, but I'm sure in the next few weeks and months that time and energy can be devoted also to other partnerships, including that with Israel.
Thank you so much. And finally, Michel, any final remarks from your side?
Maybe to come back to my point about consensus. It seems that for me, the compass was the crystallization of a new consensus on the security environment of the EU and a number of actions, policies to be pursued. It seems to me that the Ukraine war is bringing this consensus to a new level with, of course, an awareness of the dangers, of the seriousness of the situation, and as I said before, on the threat, simply, on the Russian threat. And now, for the next months and years, the question is to know if we are going to go from a consensus on papers and on first actions on the current crisis to a consensus on policies and policies in the long term.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, it's been a genuinely fascinating first panel. I'm delighted that we've been able to touch certainly on the areas of consensus, but also touch on some inevitable differences of perspective that we will inevitably see across the member states and the regions of the European Union. That's been extremely interesting and really a privilege for us, those of us here in Tel Aviv, to be able to hear the perspectives from across Europe. And I also just want to thank my colleagues here in the room technically who have made it possible also for us to see and hear everybody. So we're going to take here a 15-minute break for some refreshments. So I invite everybody here to rejoin us in 15 minutes, and also those of you who are joining us on Zoom to join us again in 15 minutes, where we will hear from Israeli experts and diplomats about how this agenda, this ambition for European strategic sovereignty is perceived here in Israel, and how and its potential impact and interaction with Israel and the Middle East. So thank you all very, very much.
So good evening, everybody. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear ambassadors and diplomatic community. When Dr. Toby Green and I thought about this conference, we wanted to connect the European agenda of reaching the first EU strategic compass to the Israeli and regional state of affairs. This is the theme of this current panel. And this was before Russia invaded to Ukraine, which added urgency to this agenda and greater EU unity, as we just heard. So during this panel, we actually asked the speakers to consider several questions. And I'll read the 4 questions that we asked them to consider. So first, what is the view of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the view in Israel regarding the EU's strategic compass and the EU's aspiration to develop strategic sovereignty? The second one was, is Israel an asset or a burden? Or to be more exact, in what ways Israel is an asset, and in which ways it is a burden to EU's ambitions in the field? The third question was, the Strategic Compass document targets partnerships as an important means to achieve the EU common goals, as we've just heard. In what ways can Israel be such a strategic partner? And in which field it has interest to advance such partnership? So this is actually now asking the same question that I asked at the end of the first panel, but now addressing our Israeli speakers. And it would be interesting to hear their opinion on the subject. The fourth question was the strategic. It's not a question, actually. It's just elaborating on the first one, on the partnership one. The strategic compass actually referred to areas of space and maritime. So what are the assets of Israel in those fields that were mentioned and stressed in the strategic compass. We will have two speakers on the stage in a minute, and I would like to apologize on behalf of Ambassador Jeremy Sakharov, former Israeli ambassador to Germany. He has returned from the United States in the flight and has COVID, and he doesn't feel so well, so he's unable to join us even through Zoom. So he apologized for not being able to attend. We will hear right now former Ambassador Roni Leshnoyar, who since 2017 until August 2021 was Israel's ambassador to Brussels. Ambassador Leshnoyar is in Brussels right now and therefore was unable to join us in Zoom. Afterwards, we'll hear Aliza Bin Nun, the Deputy Director General for European Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And since 2015 until the summer of 2019, she was Israel's ambassador to France. So this is in particular, I think, of relevance to our session. And followed by Eran Etzion, former deputy head of the Israeli National Security Council. And Eran also served as the head of policy planning at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. After they will speak, each one for about 7 or 8 minutes, we can then open for Q&A from the audience. And the ones on Zoom, feel free to write your questions in the chat and we can read it through there. For Israel in particular, and the Middle East. Thank you for agreeing to answer our main questions for this panel. One of the aims of this conference is to open a discussion about what the aspirations for EU strategic sovereignty means for Israel in particular, and the Middle East more broadly. What are these implications in your view?
So, good morning, good afternoon, Maya. Thank you for having me. So I believe that there isn't too much significance or importance for Israel when it comes to European sovereignty. And this is based on what we know about Israel's security doctrine, which is based on Israel's ability to defend itself by itself against any combination of adversaries, and only in case of need, to seek American support. I think that most EU member states are in the same opinion that once Europe will need military protection and defense, they will turn not to European sovereignty, but to American power and might.
Okay. So the common view among Israelis that I spoke with before the event expressed wide skepticism towards the possibility that the EU will become a strategic sovereign player. It seems to me that you share this view. If you are advising the Israeli government, what would be your assessment of the prospects, and in what ways would you say this policy agenda is an opportunity for Israel, and to what extent is it a threat?
Europe is still, and we envy Europe for that, is still very much a continent of peace. And in the toolbox of European prime ministers and presidents, you will find tools of peacetime, not wartime. And in order to change the concept, you need time, you need to mobilize the population, you need to invest heavily in your military. And Europe is far, far from that, years, if not decades, from gaining sovereignty. Now, my advice to the Israeli government is we have to pay attention to what Europeans are doing. We have to follow the discussions in Europe and start thinking about what will be the significance for Israel if, at any point of time, they will approach or gain strategic sovereignty. So first, yes, let's think about it and what's in it for us. And secondly, I think that if asked, yes, Israel must be ready to consider any European request. It's in our interest that Europe will continue to be a continent of peace, of values, of freedoms, and of economic prosperity. And Israel must be ready to continue to cooperate with its European allies in doing that.
Okay, so I gathered from your answer that you see Israel more as an asset, less as a liability. The common view is that the United States is decreasing its involvement in our region and is more oriented towards China, nowadays Russia. Yet the European Union's interests are much more directly tied to this region, which is its southern neighborhood. So to what extent can the EU or its members fill some of the vacuum the US seems to be leaving in this region?
From the Israeli perspective, and I think also that this is the perspective of many Arab countries, and I say this based on my discussions with Arab diplomats in Brussels and outside Brussels. In general, Europe gave us, Israelis and Arabs, little reason to trust it and to ask Europe to intervene in any of the conflicts in the region, especially for us, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At times of crisis, we had issues with our European friends when it comes to military support, American overflights, for example, in the past, or European embargo, and in the field of diplomacy. Europe did not side with Israel in the multilateral fora, even when it was absolutely clear that Israel had every right to defend itself within international humanitarian law. So there is a lot of skepticism in the region about European intentions. It's okay that Europe will protect its interests and will care less about others' interests. But this is why I don't think that Brussels will be the first city to get a call from Jerusalem. I still believe that it will be Washington, D.C.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ronnie. How do you see the war of Russia in Ukraine in that sense? It seems that it is pushing, not from willingness, but out of need, the Europeans, maybe not to strategic sovereignty, but to reformulate their common security and defense policy.
It depends if European leaders will be willing and able to pull public opinion behind them to approach this autonomic, this strategic sovereignty that they want. Some of them want so much. By the way, not all of them. In fact, if you ask me, not most of them. So they have a huge challenge to remind their population about the threats that Europe is facing and will continue to face, not only a Russian threat, and what it means in terms of European investment, policy, diplomacy, economic, social, etc., because the population will have to pay a price, maybe that price. I don't know really what is the answer to this question. Much depends on how the war in the Ukraine will continue and develop and for how long.
Okay. Thank you so much.
At the outset of my speech, I wish to thank Dr. Gil Musiano, CEO of Mitvim Institute, and Dr. Maya Sion Tzitkiyahu, Director of the Program of Europe-Israel Relations at Mitvim, for organizing this event, and to Tel Aviv University for hosting it. I would like to thank Dr. Sadeh and Dr. Green and everybody who really helped in organizing it. Ambassadors, doctors, professors, distinguished guests, students, ladies and gentlemen. It is very important to me to hold and participate in events that enable us to talk about Israel's relations with the EU. This event is even more significant as this year we are celebrating 65 years of Israeli-EU relations. Israel and the EU have a common cultural and historical past, which is based on shared values of democracy, human and civil rights, and the rule of law. For these reasons, Israel is most similar to the EU in terms of its political, cultural, economic, and technological development. Israel's entrepreneurial and innovative values in the fields of science, cyber, and digitalization, dealing with COVID-19 and climate change, make it a key partner of the EU, in fact, its closest partner, which complements its capabilities. In terms of trade, putting aside 2020 for COVID reasons, every year exceeds the previous one. The trade balance jumped 16% between 2019 and 2021 and now stands at $61.8 billion. Since 2016, the trade balance has almost doubled. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we witnessed this partnership enrich our mutual capabilities to fight against the virus as we shared knowledge regarding it. As an expression of strengthening partnership, this year we signed the Association Agreement of Israel with the 9th R&D program, Horizon Europe, the most ambitious program of the EU in this field, with a budget of around 100 billion euros. We are now looking forward to joining other programs in culture and other fields. With regard to Europe-Israel relations, it is important to mention that Israel also maintains a close relationship with NATO, and we have just been accepted to another working group as a partner state. Israel has a lot to contribute to the European Union, and we are pleased to continue developing our cooperation in tackling the common challenges that we face. We must work together to realize the potential in our relations, while at the same time finding a way to bridge differences of opinion. There is no better way to do so than to convene the Israel-EU Association Council that will give expression to this value, cultural identity, cooperation, and political aspects of the relationship. We expect that the Council will still be convened under the French presidency. On this note, it's a pity the ambassador is not here. A word of thanks should be given to President Macron, who said that France will take steps to enhance relations between Israel and the EU. In the past year, we have witnessed a significant improvement in our relations with the EU, both as a whole and with its member states. Minister Lapid attributes great importance to our relations with the EU, and his positive visit in July 21 to the FAC, his first in office, stands as a testimony to that. Many European leaders have visited Israel, and in this context, we are pleased to see the resumption of the high-level EU official visits that are expected in the coming weeks and months. It is worth mentioning that after a few years, relations with Sweden have once again been normalized. The visit of the Foreign Minister of Sweden and her meeting with Minister Lapid have brought relations back on track, and we are now blossoming with many activities, both ongoing and planned. One more important comment on the subject of Israel-EU relations. Anti-Semitism is a common challenge that threatens not only Jewish life in Europe, but also the core values of the EU. There is no room for a compromise in this battle, and we must wage a fierce war against it. We appreciate the commitment of European nations in the fight against this repulsive phenomenon, as expressed by the adoption of a strategy to combat anti-Semitism and to develop Jewish life throughout the continent. On the issue regarding the question of strategic sovereignty and its meaning for Israel and the Middle East, I know you're waiting for that, Maya. On the issue, we have recently witnessed a significant game-changing event, the Russo-Ukrainian war. This event raises and sharpens questions about who is a rival or an ally, as well as issues including security, technology, cohesion, along with more classic elements of immigration, the fight against terrorism, etc. With respect to strategic sovereignty, since we share with Europe the same values and democratic system of government, we look favorably on any development that increases stability and helps the EU and its immediate and distant surroundings to successfully face challenges. Accordingly, We believe that Israel is an asset to Europe, as previously said, a pluralistic society, a democratic system of government, a strong and prosperous economy, R&D and world-leading innovation, an entrepreneurial spirit, and one that also has demonstrated its ability to maintain relations with key players in the Russian-Ukraine war. In this context, we can add our hope that in realizing and implementing the concept, that the EU will also succeed in formulating a policy vis-à-vis Iran that will ensure stability and peace in the Middle East. In parallel, the strategic compass paves the way for cooperation between the EU and its partners, and in our case, with Israel. In the chapter dealing with tailored bilateral partnerships, it is mentioned with regard to the southern neighborhood, the interest to share knowledge against terrorism, violent extremism, radicalization, cyber, hybrid threats, and more. Israel is a partner in all these fields, as it is a natural partner of the EU. We see this in our participation for over a quarter of a century in Horizon Europe. We saw it in growing European interest to share information, giving to Israeli experience how we successfully dealt with COVID-19, and there are many other examples. Summing up my speech, new strategic ideas open new opportunities to cooperate as partners. Thank you.
Questions, you mentioned very much the basic of the relations, the values, science, technology, cyber, digitalization, and other challenges. And also, I think I was really glad to hear that you addressed climate change, which until recently Israeli society has paid attention to, and I would very much hope that in the future we will pay more attention to that as the EU does. I welcome Eran Etzion, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Maya, Toby, Tal, Gil. I will try to address some of the issues that Maya presented us, but I want to start with a commemoration. This morning we buried Ambassador Uri Savir, who was Director General of the Foreign Ministry and Chief Negotiator in Oslo and elsewhere. I was very fortunate to work with him for a very intensive 2 years in the mid-90s. He was also a staunch believer in the Israeli-European strategic ties, so I wanted to commemorate him. The first question I think Uri would ask within the context of such a discussion is, what is the goal? What is the vision? What is the strategic compass for Israel-EU relations? And as I think we all know, this is a question without answer. Unfortunately, it's even a question without a question. Nobody is asking it anymore. There used to be times in which it was part of the certainly professional discussion, but also even public debate in different times. And I think it's sorely missing, and I will try to impress upon all of us and whoever is watching that we now have an opportunity to revive this kind of discussion. In the past, when this was a topic of discussion, Israel-EU strategic relations, strategic upgrade, even Israeli membership in the EU in different shapes and forms, and I was working on actual projects in the Foreign Ministry and in the National Security Council that were looking very closely and very professionally, broadly, in different scopes and different outlines and models for this kind of a future strategic compass, if you will. But it was all tied very tightly by the Europeans, and to a certain extent even by us, to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and to Israeli integration in the Middle East. And when the peace process died, a lot of the discussion, most of the discussion also died. I would try to contend that the dramatic historic change in the strategic global environment that is now emanating from Europe because of the Russian war of aggression on Ukraine is actually a historic opportunity to restart and reset this kind of conversation about the strategic relations between Israel and the EU. The rules are being rewritten as we speak. Today, Sweden and Finland have officially submitted their request to join NATO, breaking 200 years of neutrality. So nothing is outside the realm of the possible in such times, and it should be recognized as such. Both Israel and the EU should completely recalculate the way they look at each other strategically and try and be much bolder and take the opportunity that history presents us. We all know, and Eliza also pointed out to it, that Israel is a global expert on confronting exactly the kind of threats that Europe is now awakening to in terms of kinetic threats, cyber threats, sea, air, and land military threats by state and non-state actors. These are all threats that Israel has been successful dealing with for decades. And I think it's beyond dispute that Israel can contribute a lot to the Europeans and to the EU in terms of combating these emerging threats. And very importantly, it can cut through a lot of the processes that if the Europeans would try to endeavor dealing with on their own, would take them years, would take them billions, and they might even eventually fail. And we have examples, ample examples in counter-missile defense and others. So the offer is there, and everybody knows it's there. Let us look at what is blocking a more serious, deep strategic cooperation between the two sides. And very quickly I would enumerate the obstacles. First is still the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I would, again, encourage the Europeans to try and reframe the way they look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in that regard. I read the strategic compass, I read the threats, I didn't see Israel-Palestine being mentioned. So if the Europeans are looking at their own strategic environment and they don't feel the need to insert the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into their threat environment or into their strategic calculation, I think this is an indication of the fact that it shouldn't block closer cooperation with Israel. And that is not a critique of European policy vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is obviously legitimate. A lot of people in Israel agree with it. And I'm not suggesting that the EU stops dealing with it. It's all about the linkage. It's all about tying the conflict into their bigger strategic calculation in terms of the future of their relations with Israel. And here I think that they need to rethink it. So this is the first block or obstacle. The second is the bureaucracies on both sides. And they are, I think, as much to blame. And as somebody who was part of the Israeli side of the bureaucracy for many years, I can attest to that. There is much more that both bureaucracies can and should do in terms of cutting through red tape, being much more bold in their thinking and in their actions, to push their leaders and the political echelons on both sides to move much faster and in a much bolder way towards a different future to the relations. The next one is the bilateral versus multilateral. We all know Israel has excellent relations, strategic relations, with some of the most important and perhaps less important European Union members. France is represented here, Germany and others. The bilateral relations are on many cases are moving on smoothly, without obstacles or hardly any obstacles, a lot of very deep strategic cooperation and so on. And when it comes to the multilateral level, things become much more cumbersome. A lot of it is natural and obvious. But again, I think that Israel should do much better in terms of the way it runs its various multilateral relations. It's an old sickness of Israeli diplomacy, and it's time we up our game on that. The last obstacle is obviously the political will. There is not enough political will, neither on our side nor the European side. And unfortunately now, at least some in Europe are now much, again, understandably, much more focused on the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine and less of the Middle East and Israel and others. And Israel always has some other preoccupations that distracted attention from Europe. But I think the political will must be found and can be found. Last point is what can be done. My proposal is to build a strategic compass which is joint to Israel and the EU and can be framed within the strategic compass of the EU in terms of what can Israel contribute to the new emerging important historic European effort to align with the strategic compass. Israel can also be aligned into that overall strategy. And we should build together a joint strategic compass or a roadmap, or call it whatever you will, which will show the way to a new type of cooperation with a new model of cooperation. We used to speak about, some people here were probably also party to these projects, the Turkish model, the Norwegian model, other models. I think we should fashion a completely new model in line with the completely new times. It is a very complex mission, but I think it is essential. We have an opportunity, and I would contend it would be easier to put something like this together than to simply continue through the usual path that we have been plowing for so many years and largely unsuccessfully, incrementally. And the basis for this new model is double. The first is jointly confronting external threat. And the second is enhancing the mutual values, democratic liberal values, which are under attack both in Europe and in Israel. So on the first count, Israel has a lot to contribute to the Europeans. On the second, the Europeans have a lot to contribute to Israel. And Israel needs to prove to the Europeans that it is still a like-minded country, contrary to its position on the Russian war of aggression and on some other fields. I don't think there are political actors in Israel which will rise to the challenge. None of them, and no offense to anyone. Hence, this is a mission for Israeli civil society here in Israel. And this civil society should engage with whoever is willing to engage with it in Europe, be it the civil society or more official circles, in the countries or in the Union. And I think, again, we have a historic moment here. There is a momentum that needs to be seized, and I throw the challenge to everybody who's listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eran. Eliza, you'll have the floor to answer some of the challenges thrown at you, or to you, towards you. And also, I would like to invite the audience to ask questions. So if you have questions, then please start to formulate them and ask, and Orny can give you the microphone. I would actually like to throw a couple of questions, or at least one central one. Former ambassador to the EU, Ronny Leshnoyar, didn't think that the strategic compass has a lot of significance to Israel. Eran, we heard a very different view, and also, Eliza, you gave some substance that Israel could play a major role. And I would like also to stress another angle of Israeli foreign policy, recent foreign policy that has been taking place during the last year, and a bit more than last year, that Israel has concluded the Abraham Accords and the normalization agreements with Morocco. So, and we have had the Negev summit recently. So Israel is, the Israeli foreign diplomacy seemed to sort of discovered partnerships in some ways, at least in regional perspectives. And I think I would completely adopt your recommendations, Eran, to also do that more intensively and to reignite Israeli-EU partnership in that respect. Definitely, I think all of us in the audience are aware of what Israel can contribute to the EU in that respect. So how do you see that Israeli moving not only with the UAE or with Bahrain or Morocco, the Negev summit also had Egypt, United States was there, but
But also Cyprus and Greece, we had that cooperation going on, and the Gaz Forum now have France and Italy as members, and Egypt and other countries. So Israel is moving to that direction. Again, I would like just to stress the partnership issue. How do you see Israel maybe moving in the future with the EU? On which aspects? Let me just.
Okay, is it okay? Everybody hears? Yofi, toda. So thank you very much, Maya, for these questions, and also Iran, you know, my dear colleague from the Foreign Ministry, and we just talked outside how much I miss him. About partnerships. First of all, the issue of Israeli-Palestinian relations as an obstacle. It was one of the obstacles that you mentioned, Iran, in your remarks. I would like to say, you know, in this context that, and this of course comes again, it connects to the Negev Summit and to the Abraham Accords issue. In the last years, I think at least, I don't know, I would say even 10 years, if not more than that, we see an ongoing tendency of an improvement, a significant improvement in the relations between Israel and the EU. And I touched upon, you know, a few examples. And this is, you know, in times when the Israeli-Palestinian relations / conflict did not really come to a solution. But I think that reality showed, both in respect to Israel's added values and to the fact that in the region, countries came to the conclusion, because of all kinds of interests, that it's better to cooperate with Israel and even to sign peace accords with Israel, even if when the Palestinian conflict was not resolved. So in that respect, I would say that I think that, you know, today the issue, and not to say that it's not important, it is important, but the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian relations, I would say, is less of an obstacle when it comes to strengthening relations with the EU and with the EU, you know, specifically, but also with European countries, you know, more maybe generally or specifically. And I gave the example of Sweden. We can say also, you know, that there is a certain kind of rapprochement with Turkey. We are trying somehow to strengthen or to connect to the Slepkov Forum, which entails Austria, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. To try, we look also at the EU in terms of sub-regions where we would like to strengthen somehow cooperation with sub-regions. Our political director is on the way to conduct a dialogue with the Baltic countries in a few weeks. This is also another example. And the most, I think, significant example would be the strengthening ties between Israel, Greece, and Cyprus with regard to the trilateral Hellenic cooperation. And just last week, there was also the 3+1, because there was a Zoom meeting between the foreign ministers of Israel, Greece, Cyprus, and the US, where they discussed how to strengthen the cooperation. And even they touched upon, you know, specific projects that each country would take upon itself. So this is all to say that, yes, Israel is connecting to the new era. Israel, I think, is today more of an asset than a liability. Back to your question. Of course, it's not for me to say to what extent Israel is a liability to Europe. I would rather emphasize to what extent Israel is an asset to Europe. And like I mentioned, it's both, you know, in the fields where Israel is appreciated, recognized, and doesn't have to explain anymore to what extent our technologies in many fields, also climate change, but not only, can be an added value to Europe, in what extent the Israeli security cooperation in many fields can be beneficial to Europe, as well as to Israel, of course, but also to Europe. To what extent the fact that I think that one of the previous participants, he was saying that we have to look at the Middle East in terms of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, in terms of the Russian presence in many places in the world, be it, I don't know, he didn't mention Africa, but he did mention the Middle East. And yes, Russia is our neighbor, not far away. I mean, they're present in Syria. And Israel has a good dialogue with Russia as well as with Ukraine. And Israel and Prime Minister Bennett, just a few weeks ago, he was traveling more than once to Moscow to talk with Putin about the war in Ukraine. So in that respect, Israel can play a role and plays a role, and has a special status, you know, in the Middle East with regard to Russia. Whereas in the same time, Israel is a like-minded country. Iran, this is back to your comment, Israel has to prove. I think that Israel, given its special sensitivities and the complexity of its situation and its interest in the Middle East and concerning its own security, I think that Israel has proven in the last 3 months that it is a like-minded country. Israel joined the 2 resolutions in the UN that dealt with the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Israel, of course, extended, you know, a vast humanitarian aid to the Ukraine. Israel is the only country till today that deployed a field hospital in Ukraine. And I think when it comes to also statements made by the foreign minister and also I think the prime minister, I think it was quite clear where Israel stands with regard to the Russian-Ukraine war. Somebody said conflict. I would use, you know, the word war. And then, you know, maybe to make a comment, Iran, back to you with regard to the fact that you don't think that Israeli politicians actually they came to the stage that they attribute importance to, or not enough of importance to the Israeli-EU relations. I think, and I tried to touch upon it, but it's only a small example. I mean, the first visit that Lapid had was to Brussels. He met with the FAC, and there he presented, I mean, first of all, his position and his policy vis-a-vis Europe, which was quite an improvement to what we saw, you know, before that. And the dialogues that Israel, or Israeli officials, and also on the level of foreign minister and visits of prime minister conducted with European counterparts is really impressive and is far larger than what we saw, you know, in previous years. So I think that there is an acknowledgement on behalf of this government, and in particular of the foreign minister, to reach out to Europe, and he talks about the importance that he attributes to the relations between Israel and Europe. Of course, it can always be improved. It can always be, you know, enhanced, and this is the aim of us, you know, officials who deal with Israeli, EU, and Europe relations. But I think that we have come quite, you know, a significant way in the last, at least in the last year, in this respect.
Thank you. Can you please pass the microphone to Aaron? And if you have questions, please raise your hand so we can see you.
So I want to start with the major point of the new situation in Europe. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
And its implications. And I won't belabor the point. I can speak for much longer about that. But again, I would say that we have a completely new geopolitical situation now globally, and it's not going to go away. It's probably going to even become more complex, deeper, and more severe, and with wider and wider implications. And to put it quite simplistically, but effectively, this is a new version of the Cold War in terms of the way, you know, Kissinger used to say, give me back the Cold War, because all I needed was one line to draw across the globe, and I would simply divide between the two camps, and I would know where I stand, and each country where it stands. Just one line. The world became much more complex since the Cold War, but now it's becoming, to a certain extent, simpler. And yes, we do have now, again, two camps, the free world and the authoritarian world, one led by the US and the EU, and one led by China and Russia. And all other countries will have to align themselves to either side, or try to play the non-aligned game.
Cut off the red tape and to introduce European products here much more easily and in a lower price. But some of the credit, at least, should go also to the EU and not only to Minister of Finance Lieberman. So we had a last question, but unfortunately, I would have to apologize. We're already reaching 8 o'clock, and we would like to maintain the time limits. So before I welcome Dr. Gil Murciano to give the concluding remarks, I would also like to thank the organizers, and we had multiple organizers, but I would like to stress in specific Hugo Delager from the French embassy, and Matthew, you as well, Christian Cassier from the EU delegation, to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, to Judith and to all the team, the wonderful team, to Paul Pasch as well, to the Mitvim, great team, so to Gil, to Orni, to Michal here, to Victoria at home, and to Rachel as well. So to Dr. Tal Sadeh, and last but certainly not least, Toby Green, who has been a great partner in doing this event. So thank you for all the organizers and for the many hours that we put into this conference. Thank you so much, Aliza and Eran, for your intake on the situation. I think it was a very fruitful debate for me. I would have to say I'm taking from it quite some good ideas for my work. And without further ado, Gil, please come forward. So Gil is the CEO of Mitvim, and he will give the concluding remarks.
This one or this one? Okay. So thank you very much, Maya. This conference is an outcome of coordination between 5 different organizations, 2 major embassies. I can tell you that building a European strategy on national security has got nothing on our efforts and the complicated task that we had with us. So again, thank you very much, Toby. Thank you very much, Maya. I also wanted to, won't going to repeat all the thank yous, but also an impressive line of speakers representing completely different dimensions. I think what we had today, and I have the luxury, or rather the dubious luxury, to somewhat summarize a very broad discussion. We moved from skepticism regarding the entire, if we heard Roni, unsurprisingly, skepticism throughout the entire concept of European autonomy, and all the way to Iran's, I would say, cautious discussions of an historic moment if we just seize it in the right way. But I think that the great value of this discussion really is a starting point in analyzing an ongoing development, really, when we speak about the discussion of European autonomy, is really about setting the questions right. We were trying today to connect between 2 topics that seemingly do not relate, between a major change in priorities, in the allocation of resources in Europe, not just related to the Ukraine war, as some Israelis see that, but a much, a long-standing change in policy, and Israel-Europe relations, really. And I think in the last discussion, we really entered the framework, the inner workings of Israel-Europe relations. And, it really leaves us with questions. And first of all, we definitely understand now, I think, that the illusion in Israel that European autonomy or sovereignty means isolation or splendid isolation, I think this is something that we can definitely refute. I mean, a discussion regarding partnerships, the idea that we are discussing not just European handling their own business and dealing with their own threat scenarios, but also developing capacities for cooperation. I think it's an integral part. I think we can establish that. But what kind of cooperation? Because I think that we discussed two levels of cooperation. Ambassador Ben-Nun clearly laid out the importance of cooperation, I would say, on strategic technical issues, from cyber to intelligence to other security matters, and that's obviously important. But I think that there's a deeper layer that Iran mentioned and others mentioned in this discussion about a real strategic dialogue, a different level of involvement, proactive involvement in the Middle East, on regional affairs, and that's a completely different type of commitment, I would say. And I'll throw a provocation at you just because it's a pretty late hour. Can we really speak about European sovereignty in the field of security without a new engagement, at least with the southern neighborhood, at least with the neighboring ecosystem. I think we had Ambassador Duclos beforehand, the former ambassador to Syria, and I think one of the major lessons is that from the Syrian civil war is that what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. And the shockwaves of events such as the war, such as a possible collapse of Lebanon, or a renewed conflict in Syria, or a number of different events, of course Iran in this case, the shockwaves of those events are going to be felt across the Mediterranean and into Europe. So can we really speak about European security autonomy without relating to those levels? And the second issue, which was mentioned here, is the fact that we are slowly turning the Mediterranean mostly, the Eastern Mediterranean, a field that Mitvim covers very closely. We are dealing with one of the next arenas for competition between, superpowers is a very old name, but between different competing powers, which would place Israel and other actors in the middle of the European discussion over security autonomy. So can we really speak about that? This is a question that is still open to be answered, basically, as we develop further. And the second narrative that I think we challenge today is that European autonomy is only about security, or at least security in the Israeli perception of security, military or otherwise. And I think we definitely established, and I relate specifically here to the words of Ambassador Seshnev. I said it right? Seshnev, yeah, perfect. That basically we are not just talking about security, we're talking about narratives, we're talking about the issue of foreign policy, but are we speaking about a change in strategic mindset on the European level? Are we talking about a slow change in, I would even go to the level of narrative, autobiographical narratives? You know, the way Europe sees itself, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and we tell others about ourselves. A different type of involvement. We speak a lot about the willingness to act in this framework, but are we speaking also of the willingness to stick our neck out in many ways? Excuse me for the bluntness. And that's actually, when we speak about the directions, this is a very important question, and there's no clear answer, and this is something that we are developing as we go. But I do think, and I will end with that we are dealing with two also opportunities, and I think Iran touched at least one of them. First of all, what happens to, if we speak about identity, to the strategic mindset of Israel regarding security cooperation. And I think we've seen it in the last couple of years, and those who follow the Negev summit definitely saw the change. The understanding in Israel that the Kahol Lavan, the white and blue, trying to resolve Israel's strategic problems only through national capacities is just not enough today. It's just not adjusted to the challenges we have from Iran to Syria to other locations. The understanding that cooperation is necessary, not by forfeiting Israeli autonomy or anything as such, but in creating or prioritizing, giving different value to cooperation on the regional level. Been a discussion, according to some rumors, about a Middle Eastern NATO. I think that's definitely an overreach, but we are talking about a different attempt to speak about autonomy and speak about cooperation. And it finds this European autonomy process finds Israel in a very unique phase on that level. And then when we think about the future and possible interfaces, I don't know. That's a different position. And the second one which was mentioned is the US withdrawal. I disagree, by the way, about if we are really seeing a US withdrawal, but we definitely have a perception of US withdrawal, which is as important in the Middle East, in places like Lebanon, from Lebanon to Iran. What is the European role here? Not instead or taking the place of the US involvement, but maybe creating the right synergic combination that would allow, compensate, or even upgrade that type of involvement. So those are, if you will, are already set opportunities that can be utilized later on. And in the end, this is part of the attempt to define whether or not we're going to see Europe involved in a number of crucial dynamics that shapes the Middle East today, from the Abraham Accords and the unique role that Europe can play in this one, to Lebanon, to Iran, to the Eastern Mediterranean. Whether we are going to see it still as an auxiliary force, a positive but auxiliary force, or a central component with a new type of set of values, a new type of messages on that level. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, our speakers. I mean, I wasn't going to mention each and every one of them. And thank you for the organization. And I return the mic to Maya.